The drum major lived a short distance from my house and could sometimes be seen sitting pensively on his porch wearing his shako, a tall, truncated cone of white simulated fur with a strap that cut across his chin, while folding the free press for his paper route. I was reluctant even to wave to him, since this was a time in my life when my greatest worry, originating I have no idea where, was that I was a hopeless coward. Although we saw each other nearly every day at school, the greetings I had offered the drum major in the past had fallen on deaf ears, and I had long since given up on the idea of getting any sort of response from him at all. I did the route for the News, a competitor of the Free Press, so it wasn't surprising that the drum major and I didn't speak. But after he scored 156 on a school-administered IQ test, and then one September day single-handedly captured an AWOL sailor by boldly shouting, "Halt!" and escorting him to the brig at the nearby base, I began to study him in a fixed and admiring way. I imagined that he might somehow hold the key to escaping my cowardice. I delivered papers in the evening from my bicycle, and as the year grew late, I was often overtaken by my fear of the dark. I had a recurrent fantasy of a muscular ostrich pursuing me in the night and pecking through my skull into my brain, a terror that stemmed from my first and only trip to the zoo. Whenever I contemplated my fears, that ostrich figured in my reflections as a kind of emblem of my spinelessness. I always delivered my papers as promptly as possible. The drum major delivered his whenever he felt inclined to do so. One afternoon in early October, he unexpectedly chose to address me. He accused me of trying to make him look bad by getting my papers onto people's porches and lawns before his. When I tried to respond, he cut me off and directed me to wait until his papers had been delivered before delivering mine. I complied with his instructions, tossing my papers onto lawns at all hours and dodging any customers who tried to complain. At school, I watched to see whether the drum major had the same effect on others as he did on me, but he was always alone. I went out of my way to watch him practice on our school's big, wind and sometimes snow-blown football field, where he would strut toward the goalpost, trailing a stingy cape and twirling his baton, his white shako tilted back rakishly until the time came for the blissful high toss and recapture of the spinning chrome-plated baton, preferably without getting beamed in the head by one of its white rubber tips. At game time, when he led our cacophonous marching band in its disordered frenzy, the entire drama hung on his ability to catch that baton. What should have been one small gesture became the centerpiece of an otherwise lurching rigmarole. There was something about the drum major's haughty gait and his seeming disconnection from the confused uproar of the band behind him that mesmerized me. Although the band, with its modest and unattractive demeanor, the players wore threadbare maroon uniforms with gold piping and were led by a hugely overweight youngster who did a Grambling-style shimmy while flogging his glockenspiel with felt hammers, was more attractive to the rest of the crowd, some members of which threw horse chestnuts at the drum major, whom they regarded as stuck-up. Drum majors back then were on the verge of being replaced by majorettes, and a position that had once been considered honorably athletic had become somehow effete and clouded with unspoken sexual ambiguity, although that ambiguity hadn't yet managed to taint our own drum major, whose pert and blossoming girlfriends all seemed to wind up losing their reputations. Nevertheless, the crowd hoped for humiliating disaster. I, strangely, hoped for his success. I waited for that high toss to produce, as if by the hand of Praxiteles, the most graceful division of space, a split second of immortality for the drum major, and for me, a lesson in courage. At the same time, Another part of me shared the crowd's wish to see him on all fours with the baton up his behind. As would become a lifelong habit for most of us, we longed to witness both spectacular achievement and mortifying failure. Neither of these things, we were discreetly certain, would ever come to us. We would instead be granted the frictionless lives of the meek. Our school played Flat Rock on the last Saturday of October, and winter was already in the air, the trees shabby with half-shed leaves. I was shivering in the crowd on the rickety exposed bleachers, watching our band wheel onto the field. When the drum major at last tossed the baton, it fell so far behind him that he had to dash into the band to retrieve it. Too late, he was swept aside, forced to stand, hands on hips, until the musicians had passed, revealing his baton on the ground, twisted like a pretzel. As he crouched to pick it up, the baying crowd was beside itself. With a sense of fearful liberation, I joined it, my community. In that uproar, I was briefly free of fear. I thrilled to the courage of the mob. Still, it wasn't quite the courage I was looking for. The following week, the drum major seemed even more isolated at school, though as always he appeared content with his solitude. Mrs. Andrews, the beautiful young wife of our thuggish football coach, who had renounced her own remarkable athletic skills to teach us history, made a special effort to console him. I remember how gently she bent beside his desk to correct his work, while across the aisle, Stanley Peabody, with his flat-top haircut, pegged charcoal pants, and flag flyer blue suede shoes, attempted to look down her blouse. Mrs. Andrews, with her shining auburn hair and her single strand of imitation pearls, was accustomed to being ogled, and Stanley was little more to her than a name on the roster taped to her desk. Her attention to the drum major was all the more surprising for the fact that she had hardly looked at him in weeks. I was a great observer of any and all interactions between the drum major and Mrs. Andrews. At that point in my life, virtually everything around me seemed scarlet, with erotic undertones, and for months now I had suspected that a relationship existed between our history teacher and the drum major. A quiet and subtle relationship, which had nothing to do with the smirking of the other boys in the class. Their behavior, I knew instinctively, amounted to nothing more than an adolescent salute to Mrs. Andrews's lovely figure. The drum major, on the other hand, gazed at Mrs. Andrews with a sort of calm arrogance that seemed to intimate possession, and which only grew stronger as rumors spread through the class. Mrs. Andrews, meanwhile, had become increasingly timid with the drum major, rarely addressing him directly, and it was with a kind of flourish that she finally called on him in class one morning. "What?" she asked, casting her eyes over the top of his curly brown hair. The tension in the classroom had reached the point where she could no longer look straight at him. "Was the principal result of the credit mobilier scandal?" Stanley Peabody leered broadly at this resumption of contact. His sidekick, Boley Cardwell, a prematurely wizened teen with lank blonde hair cascading over his forehead, grabbed his crotch surreptitiously and rolled his eyes in feigned ecstasy. Legs stretched in the aisle and crossed at the ankles, fingers laced behind his head, the drum major said, "You tell me." He had the affectless James Dean look-down pat. An electric silence filled the room. This was clearly a bit of amorous badinage disguised as classwork. Mrs. Andrews's face colored. The drum major seemed to have her just where he wanted her. "Perhaps," she said, "you feel I have asked you the wrong question." "Could be." "In that case, Why don't you pose a question for the class based on this week's reading? The drum major leaned forward, dropped his elbows to his knees, drew his feet back under his chair, and held his head for a moment before looking up. He said, "Who is buried in Grant's tomb?" By the end of the day, he was the most important boy in school. People lingered to watch him pass in the hallway and gave him plenty of space at his locker. Mrs. Andrews added girls' physical education to her teaching load, and from then on, she seemed always to have a whistle around her neck. She moved with a new formality, even when teaching history. While Stanley Peabody and Bowley Cardwell headed a small group that gathered in the bleachers to watch the girls run wind sprints, the drum major sat apart, focusing on Mrs. Andrews. On co-ed gym days, her husband, Bud Andrews, was also on the field coaching the boys, a classic phys ed instructor in sweats and a severe crew cut that bared his scalp on top. One cold, dark afternoon, when the windows of the gym were silver with reflected light and the air was sour with sweat, Coach Andrews suddenly sprang into the bleachers, lifted the drum major into the air, and shook him like a rag doll. The drum major managed to retain his smile even as his head was flung about. Coach Andrews was suspended from his job and would never have been reinstated if it weren't for the generally held view among the faculty that there was something fishy about the drum major. To avoid further misunderstanding, a tutor was hired to help him complete his history requirement, though everyone agreed that Mrs. Andrews could hardly be held responsible for her husband's freakout. I spent my paper route earnings on small things: an imitation Civil War era forage cap, a British commando knife, steel taps for my shoes, muskrat traps. I briefly fell prey to a magazine coupon swindle whereby I tried to win the baby monkey whose huge eyes dominated the advertisement, but as I fell behind in my payments and began to doubt whether the monkey would ever be shipped, I switched programs and wound up with a much cheaper flying squirrel, which bit me savagely and flew around our basement for 2 days before escaping through the window. My father said, "Next time you got $10 to spare, don't throw it away on a squirrel." My luck changed when, while digging up a jack-in-the-pulpit as a gift for my mother, I discovered an old brass compass, which I imagined had once belonged to the Voyageurs, Jesuits, Recollets, and their various bands of Potawatomi, Wyandots, and Hurons. The compass was always in my pocket, a talisman, the one thing that stood between me and the dreaded unknown. By this time, I had recognized that fear was the defining feature of my life. My mistake lay in believing that I was unique in this. Still, I had gone back to delivering my papers on time. I had envisioned this as a test of my mettle, but the drum major seemed to have forgotten all about me. He said nothing. I dreamed of becoming a warrior or a big game hunter. If I was going to prove myself, I would need a real trial. In January, Lake Erie froze nearly to Canada. One evening, standing before its ominous expanse in my skates, with a wool cap pulled over my ears and a long scarf wound around my neck and crisscrossed over my chest beneath my blue Navy surplus pea jacket, I left the shore. I planned to face down the specter of my fear by going as far as I dared toward Canada, or the Livingston Ship Channel if the icebreaker had been through. I hoped that my love of skating would propel me through the worst of my worries. I struggled over the corrugations of the shore ice and then ventured onto smoother, glacier terrain that rewarded me with long glides. I could see bubbles below me and the white bellies of upended perch and rock bass. I began to dream of landing in Canada on that foreign shore from whence, according to Mrs. Andrews, the Redcoats had once launched sorties against our colonial heroes. I began to imagine a visit to the old British fort at Amherstburg. I would skate home with tales of imperial ghosts and whatever other secret existences I might discover in those places where only the most courageous ventured. I would tell Mrs. Andrews what I had done. These dreams enlivened my skating, and I raced on, stroke after stroke. One day, years afterward, I would come to view this night as the template for the many disasters I later created for myself. But at the time, risking my life in the gathering darkness on a day when I had cowered at the thought of a paper cut or an infected pimple produced no awareness of contradiction. I felt only the allure of the hard, perfect ice, cold snap ice, unblemished by wind during its formation. It was impossible for me to imagine the drum major out here in his shako like an animated Q-tip. There would be no prancing among the crows and ice-killed fish for him, I gloated. I kept going. If I turned back, I told myself, if I let the falling dark turn me back, I would never be any good, and the fog of cowardice would envelop me forever. The ice seemed to rise before me and disappear into the twilight sky, as though they were one and the same. The lights that had shone briefly on the shore were gone now, and I had yet to see my first Canadian light or the outlines of the fort. I reached for the old compass in my pocket. When I stopped to reconnoiter, I felt the cold penetrate, and I adjusted my scarf. It was time to go home, and I knew it. But I couldn't leave at the first wave of panic. I would press on into the blackness just long enough to prove that it was I who had elected to return and not those forces which were always rendering me worthless in my own eyes. Such thoughts produced an oddly inflexible gait in my skating. I reached my feet stiffly through a space that I couldn't confirm with my eyes. Suddenly, the sound of my blades, which had seemed to fill the air around me, was replaced by another, more murmurous tone, like a church congregation heard from afar. I was gliding toward the sound when a vast aggravation of noise and physical turbulence erupted, and a storm of ducks took flight in front of me. It was water. The lake heaved a gloomy sigh, and I found myself, after some minutes of agitated effort, almost at the edge of the ice. I skated off in a panic, and when I was once more standing squarely on black ice, I stopped and recognized that I was lost. A step in any direction, and I could drown in freezing water. I was becoming claustrophobic, too. I had an incongruous sense of airlessness, as though I'd been locked in a windowless room. I knew that I was going to die. I lashed out first at my own entangling fantasies, the hated redcoats, the pursuing ostrich, and then at death itself. My bowels began to churn, and I squatted on the ice with the pea jacket over my head, my pants around my knees. I recited the Lord's Prayer in a quavering voice. I was answered. A deep, rhythmic throb gathered slowly into a rumble. A light emerged from the blackness in front of me, followed by several others, until they formed a line streaming toward me like comets. Then, just as the sound was at its most intense, an enormous black shape rose before me, causing the ice to groan. It was not the god I had expected. The lights streamed away, and all was silent again. A freighter bound for Lake Superior. I extracted the compass from my pocket and began to bargain with death. It took some concentration to rotate the battered brass case until I had north pinned down. Then, staring at the cloudy glass held almost under my nose, I began to skate as rapidly as I could, placing all my faith in the ornate W. I moved fast on the cold mirror beneath me, creating my own wind, knowing that if the compass was faulty after all its years in the ground, I would skate straight off the ice into a world from which I would not return. But a kind of faith conveyed from the freighter god to the compass, kept me peering into my cupped hands as I pressed on with all I had. In a short time, I could make out some shapes in my path. Fishermen's shanties. A series of small houses positioned over round holes spudded through the ice, through which the occupants could angle for perch or hang for hours, iron spear in hand, to await the great pike, drawn to them by a hand-whittled wooden perch decoy. By night, these shacks were all deserted. But one shanty revealed a flickering light, and to it I attached all my hopes. At its door I made out voices, and I stopped before knocking. They were voices from my classroom, and I listened, as if dreaming, to what sounded like a quarrel. First, the drum major, his voice cocky, bantering. The other seemed to plead and whimper, and was, of course, Mrs. Andrews. And then there were different sounds, less precise than words. I skated off as silently as I could, afraid that if they caught me, they would have to do something terrible to me, whether they wanted to or not. I had no business knowing what I knew. I hit land a long way from where I'd put on my skates, and I was obliged to traverse a considerable distance, tottering on my blades across pickerel weed and pebbles, waving my arms for balance while thanking everything around me for the continuation of my days on earth. But in a scrap of tangled beech woods, my pious thoughts soon crumbled beneath a lurid new vision, something as dark as the woods around me. It was as if, as I conquered one fear, another had risen to take its place, even more daunting than the last. Light from the small houses that lined the narrow road to the shore made wild shadows in the leafless trees. I heard dogs barking behind closed doors, and one homeowner let his beagle out while watching me from his doorway. I tried to manage my movements, but there was no way to walk normally, nor any way for an observer to see that I was wearing skates. The beagle approached to within 10 feet of me and sat down, emitting a single reflective bark as I passed its lawn. The owner remained in the doorway and watched me pass in silence. I gave him a little wave, which he didn't return. I didn't go on the ice again that winter. It seemed that there were better things to do. As the days grew longer, I often saw the drum major starting his paper route as I got home from mine. We didn't speak, but my customers got the news on time.